welcome everyone. We'll get started here fairly shortly. And actually, while we're waiting, we'll just invite you all, and we'll introduce ourselves properly here in a second. But we'll invite everyone to, in the chat, if you're willing to share your name, where you're coming from, and any pressing questions that you hope to address in the next hour and a half with us. So again, in the chat, your name, where you're coming from, and any pressing questions you hope to address in some way. And we'll start properly in about a minute. Mary, is that?
Yeah, that sounds fine.
Okay.
Whenever Gary says.
Yeah, so we've got 60 people in already. There's a couple more coming in now, so yeah, just a few seconds and I'll keep letting people in as the session starts. Is
it like the gates at a big concert, Gary? Like literally a bunch of people have to kind of get through the same small number of gates?
No, they're all appearing right at the same time actually, so.
Oh, okay.
And there's a lot of stuff on the chat already, which is good.
Okay, nice. Yeah. And again, for those of you who came through the gates a little bit later, just people are sharing in the chat their names, where they're coming from, and any pressing questions you hope to address in the next hour and a half or so. And we'll start in about a minute. Or Gary, should we wait till the fuller number are present?
We've got just about 70 now. So I'll start now, I think.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Yeah, well, welcome everyone. I'm Alfredo Ortiz Aragón, and my closed section editor and co-facilitator is Mary Brydon-Miller, who'll be speaking with us in a little bit as well. And this is the action-oriented forms of participatory research section of the brand new SAGE Handbook of Participatory Research and Inquiry. And we're very excited to share a little bit about our section and really give some time for our authors as well to share about the specifics of their chapters. So I'm gonna run through a few ideas, and including sharing the agenda here in a second. Just to get started, action-oriented forms of participatory research. These are some of the names that you're going to see throughout the section. Media research, participatory action research, and then which is PAR, and then PAR labs, generative ethics, CBPR, or community-based participatory research, systemic action research, transformative story work, theory U, awareness-based AR, SelfField, Memoria Lab, etc. I think I got them all. These are just some of the names that people call the work they're doing when they're doing action-oriented forms of participatory research, and we'll hear a lot more about this over the next hour and a half. All right, so just a quick agenda. The welcome was basically asking you all in the chat to share again your name, where you're coming from, and any pressing questions you hope to address in the next hour and a half. So please continue, and the welcome will continue as long as you're chatting in there. And we'll try to draw some of those questions a little bit later in a little bit later moment of the session. I'm going to go now into framing. What were we trying to do? What was our handbook section all about? We'll then invite our authors, the ones that are present, to briefly introduce their chapters, and we'll give you a little specific instruction on how to do that in a second. We're then going to take the bulk of the time in an author fishbowl, which we'll explain more when we get to, and Mary's going to facilitate that. And then we hope to have time at the end to do a little bit of breakout rooms and just talk about what's resonating with us and what we're taking away from the whole thing. All right, so I'm going to frame the section really quickly. And first of all, when Mary was invited, and then Mary dragged me along to be the section editor.
I think it happened the other way.
It happened one of those times. But at first we were just excited because we had worked on the same project, and we'd worked together for many years. We had worked together as section editors in different sections of the SAGE Handbook of Action Research, it's like, wow, this is great. And we love the people who are convening this, let's do this. And then suddenly we had a little bit of a dilemma, which was, isn't it all participatory? All the forms of action research that we're talking about are all participatory, and the whole handbook is called the Handbook of Participatory Research. And isn't it all action? Aren't all of these participatory approaches trying to generate, use action to generate knowledge? And aren't they all using participatory processes to contribute towards some sort of action, some sort of change? So we were a little bit perplexed, and we realized we maybe had gotten into something that was above our heads. How are we going to separate out this thing called action orientation within a handbook of participatory research that is already probably focused on action throughout the entire thing? So this is our perplexed phase. Then, because we didn't get stuck there, we reflected. And we reflected for a long time, and we decided on a specific framing, which I'm going to share now. That's us reflecting. All right, so we decided to go back to action research and say, well, what are some 3 key ideas that we can maybe pull something out of to make our section at least differentiated in some way? And those 3 ideas are around acting to learn, or taking action for learning purposes, learning to act, harvesting knowledge from that action and being able to use it to inform future action, and participation of those who know, of knowledge holders, experience holders. I'm going to break these down very quickly. So when we're talking about acting to learn or taking action to learn, we're talking about the way knowledge is generated, or sorry, the way people act and do things and get things done in everyday life. We're also talking about whatever it is that we do when we do community engagement. We're talking about very specific ways of generating knowledge through action using identity-based or embodied methods, which we're going to hear quite a bit about from our authors. Immersion, working with people, but also formal research methods, observation, interviews, and focus groups. These are all ways of taking action for purposes of learning. Prototyping, which we're going to hear a little bit about as well. Participating in other people's events, doing interventions in education and health, action experiments of different kinds, advocacy and protest are all forms of taking action for the purposes of, in some cases, generating change, but also in purpose of generating knowledge and learning. So the question is, when we do acting to learn, what knowledge emerges from our actions? And that brings us to the other side of this kind of equation, learning to act. What are all the ways that we take the knowledge that we're generating and actually turn it into evidence, turn it into something that's beyond, that's more usable that's more usable in terms of an action research process or a participatory research process. So we have the whole suite of reflection, data visualization, participatory analysis, which we're going to see some cool stuff from Danny Burns, research walls, coding, all the traditional ways we can think of, and other forms of processing data, not just for research, but for use, generating the data to be able to use it tomorrow, to be able to inform our next steps, right? And so the question here is, what action follows when we learn to act? And of course, the third part of the formula is, not a formula, but the third part of these 3 core ideas is participation of those who know. So of course, this obliges us to ask questions around who knows, whose knowledge counts, and who decides. And I'm taking from someone who's influenced many of us, Robert Chambers, and using some of his language here. And this is a picture that I like of a process I participated in Southern Peru of just a range of nonprofit and community stakeholders making sense out of an experience together, including little baby. And to ask the question, who knows and whose knowledge counts, also obliges us to ask the question, how do we know? So we know that we know, even though our research textbooks often tell us that we only know by using questionnaires, doing observation, conducting interviews, and focus groups. We actually know in multiple more ways than that. And of course, people in this space know that. We learn and we know by talking, by walking, engaging, reflecting, feeling, writing, workshopping, meeting up, capturing, performing, etc. Any way that we live normal life, is a valid research tool because that's how we generate knowledge. So when you pull these three things together, we thought we had something, and we had enough to be able to then come to our authors and say, hey, try to write about this or try to focus on stories about this. So this is the same three ideas. The idea being that participation by those who know in acting to learn and learning to act can yield practical improvements, accumulated actionable knowledge, and energy to continue acting. So we said, let's give them some questions around these three things. So here they are. We asked our authors specifically to respond to, on the side of acting to learn, in your experience that you plan on sharing, how was action used in this experience to generate learning and or provoke change? Action as a way of knowing. Isolate that if you can. We also asked who took action and how did the different actions connect to different participants' ways of knowing? How was action culturally accessible, appropriate for everyone who was participating? And then on the side of learning to act, we asked questions, when you did act, when you did kick up dirt and generate knowledge together, how was that knowledge used not only as an end product or a result, research, but as an input to further action research cycles, community-based research cycles, et cetera. Another way of asking that is how were feedback loops generated? And ultimately, how were diverse knowledges accessed and utilized to inform the process? So these were the guidelines, again, not a straitjacket, but just saying, hey, we really want to make a contribution to the idea of action for action as a way of knowing in this section of the handbook. Can you all help us out by trying to highlight these elements in the experiences you've had for this section? Mary, would you like to add anything to that framing?
Oh, I think that's perfect. I would just say that we curated very carefully in terms of inviting authors that we thought could really speak to this. And I think we're both really pleased with the range of contributions that we got that did that. So we're looking forward to hearing from everybody.
Cool, thanks. All right, so that's how we framed it. And we're gonna move into have our authors introduce themselves, but I just want to share some images that I asked the authors if we could use these. And these are, let me move can't see my own images here. Okay, here we go. These are actually images that appear in the different chapters. And I just want to kind of highlight how the authors are really playing with this idea of knowledge from action, what I call participatory action knowledge. And here in the very middle, we'll hear more later, but Bo Reimer and just the idea of how does placing a periscope in the middle of the city to be able to look at something else and imagine a different city, how does that change what people can see and envision about their own city, in this case, Malmö, Sweden. Up here on the left, Memoria Lab, how does the act of just walking around and being able to assume different roles related to the Basque Spanish civil conflict, how does that allow people to talk about things that they couldn't talk about otherwise? The method, walking, role playing, how does that change the dynamic? Here on the right, Nathalie Wamba, how does just taking pictures of the current buildings and using that in a bigger photo voice process allow people to finally name things that they're not satisfied with their own community? Here on the bottom right, how does generating not just a small number of stories, but hundreds of stories, and then inviting the community members to do a participatory sense making, how does that turn story into knowledge, into evidence that people can actually use to change their lives? And then this third one I'm going to come to in the final slide before we turn to our authors. This little flower here. How does a very powerful and well-tested but continually tested community-based participatory research conceptual model about talking about context and partnership processes and interventions and research and outcomes, how does that become customized and accessible to people in different ways in different parts of the world, where people are able to pull the real life out of what is otherwise a conceptual model. These are a small number of the fascinating themes that our authors grappled with, and we're excited for them to introduce their chapters now. So what we're going to do now is we're going to ask our authors to introduce their chapter in 1 minute, knowing that you're going to be able to go into much more detail about your chapter when we come into the fishbowl, which will follow this moment. So we're going to start off with chapter 41, Tools for Action Media Research as Collaborative Action Research. Bo Reimer, if you're here with us, Bo, please introduce your chapter.
Sure. You saw the picture Alfredo showed of a future periscope. This is about the relationship between media research and action research, arguing for why that link has to be strengthened, why action researchers should use the tools that media can help, and how media researchers should stop not just observing from the outside, but actually taking part. And one example, and I'll give examples from the Media Lab in Malmö. The one Alfredo showed was how people, by putting up a future periscope where you can see the city in new ways, you can make that into a discussion point about what the city should look like, but not just letting the experts do the visions, but also letting people take part in the drawing and making these visions and making them available for others to discuss. Yeah.
Thank you, Bo, and we look forward to hearing more about that. Let's go with Inigo, Memoria Lab, Dialogue, Memory, and Social Healing in Basque Country.
Hi, everyone. Memorial Lab initiative, basically, it's based in citizen encounters who usually don't know each other. They are open encounters, so we don't know who may show up. That they come together to process the experiences they had during the Basque conflict, the last decades. And all together, each of them brings their own memory about it. And together we sort of interweave a memory, a collective memory. And in the process of doing that, people in a way process what happened to them. They update themselves, their identity in relation to the past identity they had during the conflict. And that sometimes may generate some healing in the persons who are taking part of these dialogues. We use different methods. There's a mixture of methods because it's also, we are developing methodologies. It's a new context for us post-conflict. So we are learning how to deal with dialogue in this new sort of moment in the Basque Country.
Thank you, Inigo. Let's go to Hannah, Victor, Israel, Ruth, or Tilda, whoever would like to introduce a participatory self and field inquiry method. All right, is Victor here?
Victor's on mute.
There you go, Israel.
I'm unmuted.
Okay.
I unmuted. Did you want us to introduce the team at all, or just to go into it?
For right now, just 1 minute, just telling us what the chapter is about. Your entire team is going to be invited into the fishbowl.
Okay, so our chapter deals with a method, or developing really a method. We were a group trying to develop a method to put in practice this idea of self and field action research, which we've been developing now for about 20 years. And the fundamental idea here is that human beings create fields. We live in fields. All social reality are fields. And we create these fields, and then these fields shape us fundamentally. And what we were looking at together was how do we then find the ways of talking and thinking and asking that enable us to see the fields so that we can then both relate to the field that's out there and how that affects us inside, and then make changes both within our way of thinking. We ask the questions, how is the field affecting me? And is that the way I want to be affected? My thoughts, feelings, and actions. And then the question is how are my thoughts, feelings, and actions affecting the field, which then broadens the area of choice for us so that we can then make choices about how to think, feel, and act that can actually change the realities in which we're in. So the whole paper is really about a process which we were developing through action for doing that. And it deals with in the field of education, and it begins with a problem with an issue that actually Hannah had. Unfortunately, Hannah can't be with us today, and we were working with her on.
Thanks, Victor. I believe Otto, Eva, and Katrine could not make it. They have another event now. So we will go to Joanna and Skip.
You skip Nathalie's.
Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped you. I would have come back to you, Nathalie's, my bad. Nathalie's, please introduce the Action Turn People's Practice. Nice to see you.
Oh, good seeing you. Greetings from New York. So in few words, I did this work, we did this work in Malawi, and it was this whole challenge to the notion of the dependency trap in which Malawi is somewhat wrapped up. It's a very, very poor country, as you well know, and there is this notion of depending on the government or depending on the NGOs. There are thousands and thousands of NGOs in Malawi, and yet the country became independent in 1967, and it is nowhere on the development scale, really. It has remained so poor despite all the help of those so-called NGOs. So economists have developed this notion of dependency trap, Malawian economists. And so the idea was to try to challenge the people and say, what could we do? What kind of action we can take to challenge that notions? So working within the school system, the action was to bring the pictures of school to the people and tell them what you are going to do about this. And that was the mechanism that helped us to unleash people agency and make them realize that they could do things for themselves and not depend on NGOs or government. In few words, thanks.
Thank you, Nathalie. And before we go to Joanna and Skip, just want to make a quick point on Otto, Eva, and Katrine's piece. They also have a fascinating framework on how to see ourselves as part of bigger systems and to really take care of the source conditions, our own soil, our own inner beings, so that we can become more sensitive and more empathetic in the work that we do. And I see a lot of connections. We see a lot of connections between that and some of the self and field work as well that Victor and his colleagues have worked on. So let's go now to Joanna and Skip, storytelling as participatory research.
Hi, everyone. Our chapter is about storytelling as participatory action research. So I guess in the universe of things that are stories, we're focusing on some very particular types of stories, which are stories that people tell about their own lives, and in particular, experiences which are often not heard or not recognized in wider narratives. So we're working with people who are living with multiple forms of exclusion. And we're interested in these stories because of their ability to have a self-making quality. So the story that you tell about yourself becomes who you are. And also because the process of telling stories is relational. So it's about how we listen to each other's stories. So we look at an example of how we've used this in our work, working with Rastafarian bush doctors in Cape Town in South Africa. And in looking at this example and thinking about our work with storytelling, we start to try and think through what the relationship is between action and knowledge, prompted by Alfredo and Mary. And I guess in our chapter, we're really looking at whether or not it's possible to disentangle these two. And we argue that in storytelling, what we see is how action and knowledge converge on one another, and that there's not necessarily a linear pathway between the two of them. And so we're interested in what does that mean for practitioners and researchers who want to work with action research, and that's what we look at in our chapter.
Thanks, Joanna. And we pulled from part of your guys' explanation of that in our introductory chapter when we were trying to make sense out of this as well. Let's go now to community-based participatory research, embracing praxis for transformation. Someone from the team of Nina Wallerstein, Lorenda Bellone, Ellen Burgess, Elizabeth Dixon, Lisa Gibbs, Laura Parajon, Margareta Ramgard, Payam Sheikhatari, and Gillian Silver.
Thank you. This is Nina from New Mexico, but our chapter involves people from Sweden, Australia, the US, and Nicaragua. And we took the CBPR, or community-based participatory research, which is a health-oriented endeavor, which community-based came from our Centers for Disease Control, and participatory research, the idea came from, actually there's participatory research from the 70s when research and scholars went out into working with social movements and activists for social change. So CBPR has embedded within it a social justice action methodology or approach, even though it doesn't have action in the title. And this, what Alfredo showed at the end, we took a kind of conceptual model that came out of a lot of literature and community consultations, and then wandered through different places around the world where it's been adapted, repracticed, repraxised in terms of reflection about how to create a story that really helps people articulate their whole process of reflection, action, praxis, from looking at their context through all the relational work that people do together to all their actions to then social justice outcomes. So it was an opportunity to kind of look at how a model could become a tool or methodology itself for recreating action and recreating knowledge at the same time. So it's used as a planning tool, as an evaluation tool, as a strategizing tool, as a support mentoring tool, and as a village. What Alfredo showed at the end was kind of villagers creating their own model for action that they can revisit every single year and add to and change and work towards health for their community.
Thanks, Nina. And Nina's piece, her team, that entire team's piece, Inigo and others also really play with the idea of northern and southern traditions of participatory research. Levinian, a little more productivist, and Freirean, a little bit more transformational and tied to social movements, and kind of drawing strengths from both, but also reflecting critically on the origins of both. Let's go to, so Alexa Kazan cannot be with us today either, but her chapter is a fascinating piece on large-scale participation of people who are being gentrified out or pushed out of their affordable housing in New York City, and finding ways to leverage and generate a lot of evidence to change policy and achieve right to counsel in New York City. Now let's go with Danny Burns, the role of collective analysis in generating ownership and action in systemic action research.
Thanks, Alfredo. So yeah, I think that this chapter is essentially about looking at both the importance of action for generating evidence, but also restating that evidence is important to generate action. And that the nature of how that evidence is generated is critical. So the sort of central premise of this chapter is that collective analysis on a large scale in this particular context is critical to building empowerment and building ownership. And it's only when you generate that ownership that you're able to really move to action. So the collective analysis process is central to the action process. And the chapter is rooted in a process which I've been facilitating in different sorts of contexts over the last 6 or 7 years, a systemic action research process, which starts with the collection of hundreds of stories by peers. So it can be bonded laborers. In our current Clarissa program, it's children working in worst wanted child labor, but they collect stories, life stories of their peers. And then they come together in collective analysis workshops where maybe 50 or 60 of the children or the bonded laborers or people living in conflict zones, they collectively analyze those stories. They produce really detailed system maps of each story, and then they combine those system maps into very large system maps, which can be 20 feet long by, I don't know, 6 feet high. And from those system maps, they generate the critical interlinkages and relationships, which they want to focus on in their action research groups. And then that leads to the creation of action research groups. So in the Clarissa program now in Bangladesh and Nepal, there are 18 parallel action research groups that are happening in each country. And those action research groups are generated out of that knowledge from the stories. Not all of them, but a lot of them, and as a result of the collective analysis. So essentially the chapter is detailing different versions of that process.
Oh, thank you, Danny. And then Mary, if you could share a little bit about both why 19 is not 50, but the fine art of getting lost. Ethics is a guide to transformative learning and participatory research.
Yeah, thank you, Alfredo. Alfredo and Victor and I wrote this chapter together, but the editors, Danny and Sonia and Joe, decided that it was sort of better situated in another section of the handbook. So we very graciously agreed to have it move out of our section, but then we got Danny in exchange. So I think it was a pretty good deal. So this chapter sort of grows out of my long-term interest in research ethics in the context of participatory research methods, and my feeling that rather than sort of assuming that we're going to be ethical and that, good intentions sort of lead to ethical action, that we need to be especially mindful of the ethical implications of the work that we do. And Alfredo and I have worked on this for some time, sort of trying to locate this within the various realms and roles of action research, thinking about all of the roles that we fill in action research processes and how each of those sort of carries with it a different set of ethical demands. But more immediately, this paper and the way it was sort of structured grew out of a provocation from Victor when Alfredo and Victor and I were at a conference together, an unconference, I should clarify, an unconference in New Zealand, days before the pandemic set in. And Victor asked us to think about the meaning of getting lost and truly getting lost in action research processes, not sort of pretending to be lost, but really sort of immersing yourself in unknown territory, and what it takes to sort of find one's way from there to new knowledge. And, we sort of talked a lot about sort of the values of maps versus a compass, and ethics is a sort of a moral compass that will potentially lead us in new directions. And while maps can be very useful, they sort of record existing territory. And what we need to do is some bushwhacking and getting out into places that no one's ever been if we're really going to create new knowledge and end up in new spaces and create change. So what we've done here is to take experiences that both Victor and Alfredo shared and try to sort of examine them through that lens of ethics as a moral compass.
Thanks, Mary. And lastly, of course, there's an introductory chapter, and we won't go into a lot of it now, but we really do try to go back to those questions I presented earlier and say, well, what did we learn in terms of action, knowledge, et cetera, participation? And we really do analyze that a lot. And I'm just gonna flash a diagram. I'm not gonna explain it, so beware, complexity is gonna be showing up here in a second on your screen. But basically, this is our minds on all of these ideas pulling in together, and we explain it, of course. But this is an introductory chapter, and if we have a chance, we'll come to this at the very end. If we don't, you can see it in that chapter. And we overlaid some of the different articles all over it. Although these chapters could have been in every single part of the map because they all do hit on a lot of different areas. So that's the introductory chapter. And Mary, do you want to say anything else before we go into the fishbowl?
Nope.
Okay, so I now pass it over to you, Mary.
Okay. I imagine many of you have participated in fishbowl exercises where a smaller group within a larger group sort of has a conversation. And in general, we do this in such a way that the conversations are permeable and people come in and out. But when we saw the numbers frankly, we were amazed at the number of people who registered to come today and how many people have turned up. We were kind of expecting maybe 20. And we had a plan A for that. And then we had a plan B for when 25 people showed up. And then we had to get together yesterday with a plan C for what if 100 plus people show up. So the first part of this is going to be a little bit less participatory, but we have built in time for the end of the session for small groups so that people have a chance to talk to one another a little bit more directly and get to know one another. But what we're going to do is a little bit of a takeoff on a traditional fishbowl. If you've done a fishbowl, you have like a large group, a smaller group sort of sits in a circle in the middle and has a conversation about some theme. People leave and come into the circle. And the conversation is kind of unstructured. We're going to structure it a little bit more than that. And we're going to use as sort of a a way to structure that, the idea of the game, Pass the Parcel. Are people familiar with this game? So at a child's game, a birthday party, say, you would have a game where the kids get together and sit in a circle, and the first child gets a box and opens the box and takes out the toy that's inside the box and gets to play with that toy. But then inside of that first box is a second box, which gets passed along to the next child, who opens up the second box and takes out the toy and gets to play with that and keep it. And then there's a third box inside that goes to the next person. And we actually used this. We did a Festschrift chapter for my friend Bjorn Nielsen. My students tease me because I pull out books to show everybody. But it's called Passing the Parcel, the Ever-Expanding Impact of Critical Utopian Action Research. So we kind of took this idea for passing the parcel from that piece. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with our first author, that's Bo, and we're going to ask Bo to reflect on the question about action research. How is action used in your studies, and how does it generate learning and provoke change? And what we're going to do is ask each of our authors in order, not just to weigh in on what their chapter is about, but to listen to what the person behind you, the persons behind you who presented first, what did they have to say, and how does your chapter then connect to what they just have contributed about their chapter? So we'll hopefully build the dialogue based on sort of responding to the people who have spoken before us and weaving in our own experiences and our own insights from our chapters. Alfredo, does that sort of capture the idea?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, so what we'd like to do is ask everybody who isn't an author, and again, my apologies that we can't have everybody do this right now, but we'd ask everyone who isn't an author to turn off your cameras and your microphones, and everyone who is an author to keep your camera on, and hopefully we'll be able to see you all. And then we'll go through the same order that's in the table of contents. So Bo first, and then Inigo, and then Victor and his team. And again, we'd like all of the authors from all the chapters who are here. And Natalie's, Joanna, and Skip. If Skip's here, I didn't see him yet. Oh, there he is. Now I see him right in the middle of my screen. Nina and her team, Danny, and then Alfredo and Victor and I. So we're going to start with you, Bo. Yeah.
And let me just, you already said it, but let me just clarify. If there's more than one author from a specific chapter present, we're inviting all of you to be part of this. So if there's 3, 4, 5 authors, please join in, because we'll go through all of you.
So, and we'll take about 25 minutes for this. And then after that, we'll have some time, we'll break out into small groups, and you'll have some time to talk with one another about some of these ideas and how it applies to your own work. So we're going to start with you, Bo, and ask you to respond to that question. And then we'll pass the parcel along to Inigo after that.
Okay, so thank you, Mary, for letting me start this. So my take is on media research in relation to action research. And I would say that a key concept then is the idea of the collaborative making of things. So in the Periscope example, the idea is that citizens together can make visions, create visions and discuss them together, but then also put them forward to other people to continue with the visions. And in the way of making here, we're using the medium Periscopes is also the drawing, not just using knowledge created by putting words together, but also doing this in forms of other kinds of symbols. And that is one of the examples we use in the book. Another one in the chapter is about that we were part of creating a tool for mobile phones, where you very early on were able to send recordings and distribute that, which was used quite a lot during the Arab Spring, where the idea was that by photographing or filming what's happening, you could create knowledge and send information to other people, but also you were able then to distribute that to the rest of the world. So it's a kind of a making that then continues onto a collaborative consumption, which in itself then makes a change and leads to action. Shall I stop there and let someone take over?
That's great, Paul. That's great. Yeah, because that sort of allows us to come back, for another cycle if you have other things you want to add. Well, the downside of getting the first parcel is, you don't get to see all the other parcels before you open the box. Inigo, are you there? And do you want to pick up from there?
Yeah. In our case, we use also different methods to provoke a certain knowledge creation, because there are different experiences and identities in the room. So we use more classical or known methods used in post-conflict or restorative dialogue environments, like storytelling. That connects me to a parcel that will come later on. Joanna Wheeler was talking about storytelling. We use that. And we also use other methods, maybe that are not so used in restorative dialogue environments, like Theory U, for example, for designing the whole process, or art therapy, to use objects as a way of conveying complex or emotional experiences that people had during the conflict, that are easier to articulate using an object than only with plain words in a rational way. So we bring like non-rational or sentient methods or embodied learning methods to help people integrate their own experience, to know better how they related to that past, and to update a little bit their identity now in relation to the identity they had during the conflict. So for me, that there's some innovation there, because this is a new context for us. We've been in a conflict for so many decades that we forgot how it's to be in a non-violent environment. So we are also doing action research around the methods to use for this sort of encounters in the Basque Country. So the parcel for me is about how the main learning for me and the main exploration that I got engaged in this initiative is about how to use embodied learning methods, sentient methods, to enrich a little bit the conversation. And also when we talk about participatory action learning, my question is about not so much about who has to be in the room, but about which part of myself participate in this conversation. Because identity-based conflicts or any conflict marginalizes a part of the self. We don't like to see that we were also perpetrators, or we don't like to see certain behaviors we had during the conflict, and we marginalize them when we talk about them. So the whole exercise of using embodied methods is for people to become aware that they are marginalizing some parts of themselves, that they are not taking part in the conversation, they are not participating in the conversation, and to bring them up front so they can start relating with them, integrating that part of themselves, but also because this is a social conflict, so it's a social construct, we do it also in the whole group. So the whole group also integrates parts of what in this society is being marginalized yet.
Great, thank you, Inigo. Victor and Israel, I don't know if other members of your team, Victor and Israel, are here, but I see you both.
Okay, I'll start. When I hear the emphasis on action, I find that it really is impossible to separate between action and feeling and thinking. And a lot of what we do in our paper is the action is the reflection on both on the action and on the field in which it takes place. And I think that what we focus on is really helping people to shift their consciousness. It's a question of seeing their reality in a different way. What we tried to do in the method that we wrote about was to structure a dialogue that reflects on an action situation through which people can come to recognize that what they perceived as reality was one optional reality. And that if they were able to get some meta perspective on that, they could shift their own feelings about it. They could shift their perceptions of that reality and change their feelings, and then change the action. So the action isn't something that just happens. The action is really a product of a deep reflection, not only internally, but also of the interaction between the specific field and that practitioner. Victor,
Great, thank you.
I'd like to build on that. I build on what everyone said now in a particular way. You know, it's interesting. We're talking about action and knowledge, but really there are many different levels. And I think if I came with I didn't know what the question I came was until now. Now I know the question I came with. So if we take what Boo talked about, he was actually talking about, you know, action on the level of a city, an urban, and later on the Arab Spring. And Ingo, if I understood, you were talking about really people involved in a conflict which is larger than them. I mean, it's not just in that group, but it was a larger conflict. And our paper looks at really a situation. It actually looks at a situation. It's reflection on a situation of a teacher with a classroom in higher education, in which there was also a conflict, which was very painful for the particular teacher and for the students. And a way of, and what was interesting though is that we were able to use through the reflection process a way of changing that reality. But then the question that I want to pose is, for me at least, I know how to do that when we can get everybody into the room. But I don't know how to do that when we're at the level of the city. I don't know how to move that next step larger. And yeah, that's really the question that I bring, is how do we, and here we're talking about reflection as an action which changes reality, essentially. It feeds into action, changes reality. And you know, that's really the question I come with to this and to, I guess, other things today, because I'm really interested in that larger level.
Yeah, great, thank you. Nathalise?
Okay, thanks, Mary. Have been listening to the previous speakers, and I'm hearing words such as dialogue, creativity, action, knowledge, context, conversations, and so those are kind of words that kind of kicking me, trying to reflect and see where we're going, and looking at my own context. One of the things that I like to say is that I did not plan my action research in Malawi. It simply happened by the tyranny of a given situation that's exactly what happened. It was not planned. I was not going with a proposal. I was in Malawi as a Fulbright. A situation happened. We had to address the situation. And I said to myself, maybe this is the time when you can see if that action research that I always have reflected on works. And then that's how we engage in that action research. The photo voice project that resulted from that came out of the process, because it was a time when we felt that we needed to involve emotions and present to the people a reality that they were ignoring or were not paying attention to. And that way you see the pictures. And the picture that Alfredo was showing in the beginning was the picture of a bathroom of a school. Imagine that kind of bathroom in our own school here in the so-called developed, let's put that between parentheses, developed countries. Would you tolerate such thing? And so when we brought those pictures to the people, and the people start looking at the picture, they said, but it is impossible that we have these kinds of situation in our country. And then I said that we told them that this is the reality. And what I did was, I was not so much leading the research, that I was hiding behind a leader of that community, a woman who has done a lot of work, but whose work was not really acknowledged in the community. And she was the one leading the situation and telling people, look, this is what we have in our community. How long should we wait for the state to come, or the NGOs to come and resolve the situation? So it was a matter of simply telling people, you have the agency, but it's up to you to unleash your potential and do that, and you can do it. I was not doing so much of the work. I was simply a participant in those dialogues. And also what happened was, it reveals additional problem. And I came to understand that there is something to be said about the tyranny of participation. Yes, we like to look at participation as something that is good, that what we should do, it's democratic, but is it? So sometimes we love to hide behind participation, and by involving people into participation, I discovered the tensions between the Northerners in Malawi and the Southerners in Malawi, tensions that are historical because people from the North were favored in the past. They had education, they had the possibility to interact with the British, and people from the South were so-called the business people. But when the country became independent, the Northerners were taking over and the Southern were not doing very well. And those tensions became very, very clear in the dialogue that took place when I was interacting with the people. So there are those notions that are somewhat hitting each other, but still they're building on action, because the action was to engage people in the dialogue. The action was to bring the school to them. The action was engaging them into changing. And the resulting knowledge was that we can do it, and we don't have to rely on government or NGOs. So it was somewhat of a deconstruction of the dependency trap that people in Malawi tend to talk about. And it's a notion that is very, very anchored in the culture. And people somewhat have project a lethargic attitude saying, oh, no, if there is a situation, the government will take care of that. We don't have to, oh, the NGOs will do that. The church will do that. And so the question, where are you? So this kind of putting the lantern on the situation and having people come and work together. And I simply was there as a servant on the side, trying to push certain ideas and letting them work the things through. So that's somewhat the action and how knowledge was being generated, and to the point that that project continues up to this day, starting in 2013. And I keep getting feedback on what happened. We did this, which is what I think. I don't know what it means, but that's where we are.
Great. Thanks, Nat, please. Joanna and Skip.
Great. Thank you, Mary. Joanna, jump in anytime here. I think I'm struck by sort of this idea of scale Victor talked about. I know I can do it in a room. How do I do it at a bigger scale? And I think you can zoom in, you can zoom out. And I think oftentimes with our systemic pressure and funders and just the hope of doing systemic transformation, structural transformation, I think we often want to zoom out and think about bigger. I think with the paper that Joanna and I worked on, we went in the other direction. How do we go smaller? How do we get, and the words that I really had picked up in the previous parcels, Natalie's talked about emotion, Indigo talked about embodiment and healing. And I think that's the things I think we were thinking about. If you zoom in this work around story, there's this really deep personal individual work that starts first and beginning there and really giving time to really understand what that means, and that there may be a lot of time that goes on before someone who's unteasing the structural oppression, the personal oppression, trauma, violence, and how these things lead to action, political action. They first may lead to some kind of personal knowledge and personal action that may be very invisible. They may not necessarily show up in a research process as something that we can document, but they're incredibly important and transformative to those people in those marginalized spaces who've endured so much. And I think that's what we were really trying to see, that there's significance to that very micro space if you really zoom into that moment of conscientization when you're using story to untangle and reveal so much. And we do a lot of growing of plants with our work with our organization. I just sort of do this little diagram of, story work really is one seed that produces various kinds of vines of the personal knowledge, the political knowledge, personal action, political action. In people's minds, those may be very closely tangled in the beginning. People may not be able to tease those out, but through story and through collective understanding together, the venues for those different things can become more clear. But that may take months, that may take years, and it may not necessarily be happening on the same time frame that our projects that we need to be done in 2.5 years. And I think that's one of the tensions in this work of going small, is how do you find the adequate time and resources to really give people the time to make sense of these very, very deep personal processes that story reveals and brings up for folks.
Great, thank you. Joanna, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I'll be really brief. I think it was Israel who said that you were working with one optional reality. And And it relates a little bit to what I heard Inigo talking about with the process of people bringing different aspects of themselves into the room and which part of yourself is there. And so I was thinking about those things, and I think there's a way in which the storytelling work that we're talking about is about not just about one version of reality, but it's about one version of yourself. So how, and I guess what we were interested in the chapter is that there is a form of research which is about working with the version of yourself, and it's not fixed. It's not, there's not only one, and they're not static. So what does that mean if we as practitioners and researchers are working with that in real time? And I have the sense in listening to everyone that, yeah, there's all these multiple layers and scales that we can talk at, but they also coexist. So when we're talking about the story work being very micro, it is also very macro at exactly the same time, and that is the tension that is really hard to manage as a researcher and as a participant, in fact. So how do we respect what is needed for that to happen ethically? I think that's a question that we struggled with a lot in our work, although we didn't write about it as much in this chapter, but it's something that I know Skip and I have, and others here have thought a lot about. And I think it's a challenge for all of us who are doing action research.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Joanna. Nina, do you and other members of your chapter team want to say something about how this connects to your work?
Well, I see Gillian and Ellen here. Let me just say a minute. I find many threads from almost everyone, and just one CBPR project I'm involved in now, we're doing digital stories, but then we're going to be digital stories produced by people about their own communities around the vaccine inequities and structural racism in their own communities, and whether it's Native or African-American or Latinx communities, they're all going to be doing their own stories, but then we're going to be using these stories as triggers for dialogue all over the state, to engage people as a whole, to think about what equity means for our state. So we're trying to do micro and macro simultaneously. This model that we have embeds so many smaller praxis, Freirean praxis, as well as in the big structures in it. It's not a single method. So I'm just finding that the links to lots of you, but the model itself is a way to think broadly, but have it come really concretely down to people's individual stories and how they connect to communities and they relate to each other, as well as how they can structurally create. I mean, a lot of CBPR work is very targeted towards health change. It's someone mentioned changing reality is really key here, not just for, I mean, it's all embedded, learning ourselves as well as we change our health conditions for greater equity. But Gillian or Ellen is on.
I don't have anything to add at this time, but it's really great to be here and see everybody.
Thank you, Gillian. Ellen, did you want to add anything?
Maybe she was on earlier and I don't.
Hi, thank you so much. And I don't have anything to add. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Let's see. Danny, I think you're up next.
Wow, thanks, Mary. Too many threads to connect here. So I was thinking about action, and I was thinking about how action opens up new pathways. And if you like, as you take a step, then you see the world afresh because you've moved into a different space. And in a way that creates more optional realities. With every step you take, you see more possibilities and more pathways and more ways of looking at yourself and more ways of looking at the world. So I think that's quite important in terms of the relationship between action and knowledge and evidence. And I was thinking, you asked the question as how does this sort of process lead to action, and how does that lead to learning? I was thinking about a process that I was involved in co-facilitating in Myanmar, And it was a particularly interesting one because it started as a project and it sort of became a movement. And what was interesting was that, that people collected stories, they analyzed them together, and explored a certain set of refugee camp detentions were amongst the youth. So young people decided to come together with other young people in those different communities. And as a result of those action research processes which started, something sort of just magical happened, and new youth groups were created across the whole of Kachin in northern Myanmar, and then more youth groups, and then a federation of youth groups, and then a link between those youth groups and the Kachin Independence Organization and the Kachin Independence Army. And then that ripples into other spaces. But what was interesting was that could have never have been imagined if the small group hadn't started.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's that step into action which opens up the possibility of a different sort of knowledge for action, and can generate something quite unpredictable and exciting in a way. So that was something that was really interesting. And I was also reflecting on this scale question, and just that, what we're seeing in the power of stories is that they work up so many different scales. And actually we can use story methods at the level of the individual reflection, but also to see those levels where people talk about something that is bigger themselves. I can't see conflict that is larger than them, or a world which is larger than us. And so just a reflection on that scale question. The way that some of the processes that I've been involved in recently, and some which have been written up in this chapter, is working, is to try and seed multiple action research groups in parallel. We have this process in Mali right now, where we have just 4 locations, which are conflict zones. And in each of those, there are 10 action research groups. So, and each of those will run for about, a year or 18 months. And then there will be action research groups in the center in Bamako, of different people, of different types of actors. So of journalists, of artists, of military people, of academics, of media people, to sort of try and create an interaction between what's happening on the ground in the communities and what's happening in other spaces. So it's sort of creating that diversity and creating those webs. So, could you go to a whole country level? Could you go to a whole city level? I don't know, but I think it's that thing about planting seeds and grow. And then that links back to the story in Myanmar, which is that you plant the seed and it ripples out and it goes beyond your process and you can't see it anymore, but it's doing something amazing. And I sort of think that's where we need to go if we want to create larger scale social transformation, is to move beyond our projects and our site and create processes which allow sort of learning and action to ripple out beyond us.
Thank you, Danny. So I'm going to call on myself and Alfredo and Victor here for our chapter on ethics. When I talk to my own students about levels of change, I always talk about sort of trying to do what I think you all are talking about, sort of working at multiple levels simultaneously and seeing, individual change as every bit as important as larger structural change, and that none of them are possible without others happening. But let me reflect for a minute on what I hear as some of the ethical threads, commonalities going through what you all have talked about, and sort of my own reaction to the chapters, sort of having worked with Alfredo to edit this section. And I think one of the things for me that's a real takeaway is the courage that I see reflected in the work that you all are doing and in the work that your participants are doing in the projects that you've done. I think about Joanna and Skip's chapter and the Bossi doctors that you worked with, and the courage that it takes to make oneself so vulnerable. And I see the same thing in Inigo's chapter. the willingness to engage with really traumatic experiences with one another and to open oneself up is an incredibly risky thing to do. And yet, throughout these chapters, people are willing to take those risks. And I so admire them for doing that. Hannah in Victor's, in his team's chapter, being willing to admit that she's struggling with something as an educator, something that she takes very seriously in terms of her own identity. And yet, being willing to risk not being right and not knowing in order to change. And I think that kind of comes back to the whole idea about being willing to get lost, which, as Danny says, is kind of, we're taking every step you take is into the unknown. And I think that that's part of what we were sort of trying to explore in the idea of getting lost, but having those kind of core ethical values around, in Bo's case, I think, what I just delights me about his work is the creativity and the playfulness that using these different media methods engages, but with really serious work then, as he talks about, like using the mobile phones in the middle of the Arab Spring, to create really substantive change, but, always with this idea of inventiveness that I just really admire in that work. So, I just, in sort of closing off this section, I'm going to let Alfredo do that. But for me, I just, really appreciate what everyone has done with these chapters and how much I've learned in the process of working with you all on it. So Alfredo, you want to have the final word here?
I'll just say that I want to highlight the value of the methods too. And so the chapter that Mary, Victor, and I put together on ethics, in fact, we were inspired by the SelfField methodology that Victor and Israel have been talking about in their chapter, along with their colleagues and Hannah's experience. And we said, well, let's use that method or a version of it to tell some of our own stories, maybe things that we didn't want to talk about so much before. And I ended up reflecting on a case study of an organization, a community development organization I worked with in Peru that didn't make it into the final product of a research because it went bad. And through kind of this reflective process and seeing what I was doing and kind of replaying it, I saw that I was pushing my agenda and that I wasn't really listening. I was listening to what some people were saying, particularly those that were saying things that I wanted to hear. And I was not listening to what the organizational leaders were saying. And that's always a difficult thing as well. But I just wasn't. I was kind of being, I was just being closed-minded. And the methodology of walking me through that process allowed me to A, see what I was really doing, and B, not overly blame myself, not that we shouldn't have some blame, but really just say, what were the dynamics in that situation that led to that, and what could I have done differently, and all of that. So I just wanted to shout out that all of these chapters have really important steps, actually accessible ways we can do things, or we can learn about things. And they're not just reflective pieces, they really are, to some degree, how-tos, or at least inspirations on how to go beyond, maybe go deeper in our stories, or how to go more broadly in thinking about systemic change. So I just appreciate that everyone really found a way to balance all of those things.
So Alfredo, I'm going to let you take the lead on closing us out.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you for coming and for being willing to share some of your experiences. We just really want to thank our authors. This was a long slog, but it was really enriching, and we loved it in retrospect, particularly throughout the process too, even though it was very difficult. But it was really, we're very proud of what came out, and we really do feel that it's a nice bridge between theory and practice. Hopefully all of us and all of our authors will find ways to help make it as accessible as possible. Danny addressed some of the difficulties with that earlier in the week. Yeah, thank you all. And we do invite you, if you had anything really insightful that came out in your conversation, or even if you want to leave a follow-up question for people to answer or keep thinking about, please share any insights, any final thoughts in the chat as you go. But other than that, we're just going to invite people to enjoy the experience, leave a comment, and we hope to see you all fairly soon in some other space.
And not a virtual space.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much.